Judge Harold Carrington had seen thousands of cases in his career. He was no stranger to the usual suspects: drivers in a rush, overworked parents, students too tired to pay attention. It was part of the rhythm of his days, the routine that kept his courtroom moving. But something about Tamara Grant's presence unsettled him, even before the case had begun. She entered the courtroom with a quiet confidence that was impossible to ignore. There was nothing flashy about her appearance, no designer clothes or expensive accessories. But there was something striking about the way she carried herself. She didn't shrink under the harsh fluorescent lights, nor did she seem to care much about the judgmental eyes that followed her into the room. She was calm, composed, but there was an intensity to her that couldn't be ignored. Tamara's eyes held something that made Judge Carrington pause. Was it resolve? Or perhaps a kind of knowing that he couldn't quite place? As the case unfolded, Judge Carrington noticed how little Tamara reacted to the accusations being thrown her way. Her demeanor was steady, almost serene, and her words, though measured, seemed to hold weight beyond the confines of the case itself. The charges were trivial, a minor infraction, yet there was a sense in the air that this wasn't just about traffic laws. He thought about how many cases he'd handled in a similar manner, and how often he'd handed down fines without a second thought. It was routine, but there was something about this one that felt different. The fine he handed down, $500, was a mere formality, yet as the words left his lips, he felt an odd hesitation. Tamara didn't flinch, didn't argue, and didn't raise her voice. She simply nodded, accepting the decision with a quiet grace that made Judge Carrington feel uncertain. Was this really all she deserved? She stood, collected her things, and as she walked out of the courtroom, her back straight and her steps deliberate, the judge watched her leave. A small, almost imperceptible part of him felt like she was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. And then, just as quickly, the moment passed, and the routine of the day resumed. Judge Carrington moved on to the next case, his thoughts still lingering on the woman who had left his courtroom with such quiet power. Little did he know that this small interaction would be the beginning of a realization that would challenge everything he thought he knew about justice. He was about to learn that Tamara Grant was far more than just another defendant. She was someone who would make him confront the very system he had spent his career upholding. After the case, Tamara left the courthouse without any sign of agitation, her expression as serene as it had been when she first walked in. The $500 fine was, in her eyes, just another obstacle, one she'd maneuver around with the same quiet resilience that had carried her through countless challenges in her life. As she walked toward the parking lot, her phone buzzed in her purse. It was a text from her assistant. "The meeting with Senator Harlan's team is confirmed for 2 p.m. Let's keep it brief, but we need to push hard on the sentencing reform initiative." Tamara didn't break stride. She was used to the hustle, the constant balancing act between legal battles and policy reform, between courtrooms and Capitol Hill. She knew the stakes. The $500 fine, though frustrating, was insignificant compared to the work she was doing. But the judge, she realized, hadn't known that. He didn't know who she was. Her role as a leader in federal justice reform was far from ordinary. Tamara had spent years working in the trenches, advocating for changes to laws that had been deeply flawed for generations. Her focus was clear: dismantle the biases woven into the criminal justice system, provide resources for rehabilitation instead of punishment, and most importantly, shift the narrative around race, crime, and justice. Her name had become well known in political circles, a symbol of the fight for fairness, especially for those who had been unfairly impacted by outdated policies. Yet, despite her influence, Tamara had always been careful to keep a low profile. She'd learned early on that a quiet approach often yielded better results than loud demands. Her strategy was to change the system from within, working with lawmakers and activists, weaving her influence into the fabric of justice reform without drawing unnecessary attention to herself. But today, that would change. As she drove to her next meeting, she reflected on the interaction with Judge Carrington. She couldn't help but wonder if he had seen her for who she truly was, or if, like so many others, He had dismissed her as just another woman trying to fight the system. But it didn't matter. She had a mission, and she wasn't about to let a fine or an uncomfortable encounter slow her down. The truth was, Tamara knew that the world of justice reform wasn't just about changing laws. It was about changing hearts and minds. She had seen too many people, too many lives, destroyed by a system that was rigged to fail them. But she also saw the glimmers of hope, the growing movement of people who were starting to understand that the system wasn't just broken, it was in need of a complete overhaul. As she entered the building for her meeting, Tamara's phone buzzed again. This time, it was an email. "Tamara, I'm sure you've seen the media coverage of your fine today. It's only a matter of time before people start connecting the dots. Don't let this distract you. Stay focused. The change you're pushing for is bigger than any fine." She smiled. Whoever had sent it knew exactly what she needed to hear. Judge Harold Carrington sat at his desk that evening, the evening light filtering through the blinds as he flipped through the stack of case files in front of him. The court had cleared hours ago, but his mind was elsewhere, on the case from earlier, on Tamara Grant. Something about her had stayed with him long after the gavel came down. It wasn't just her calm demeanor, or the way she handled the fine without protest. It was the feeling that she was someone who didn't belong in that courtroom, at least not in the way he had treated her. He'd sentenced hundreds of defendants in his years on the bench, each case typically no more than a brief transactional exchange. Fines, penalties, and the occasional jail time. Nothing that lingered. But Tamara was different. Something about her presence had made the entire process feel off, almost as if he had missed something important, something he should have known but hadn't taken the time to understand. That nagging feeling wouldn't let him go, so against his usual routine, he found himself Googling her name. The search results were overwhelming. Headlines, articles, videos. Tamara Grant wasn't just an ordinary person. She was a leading advocate for federal justice reform. Her name had been popping up more and more in national news, attached to efforts pushing for sweeping changes in the criminal justice system. She was involved in high-level conversations with lawmakers, speaking out against systemic inequalities, and pushing for reforms in sentencing, bail, and rehabilitation. And what struck him the most was her focus on race and its undeniable intersection with the law. Carrington felt his stomach tighten as he scrolled through more articles. He read about her involvement in high-profile initiatives, her testimony in front of Congress, and her powerful speeches that had been covered by major outlets. This wasn't just a woman caught in a minor legal issue. She was a force for change, a leader in a movement he had barely given thought to. The implications hit him like a wave. In that moment, the fine he'd imposed earlier seemed trivial, even absurd. It was clear now that Tamara's work wasn't just about reforming laws. It was about confronting the very foundations of the justice system itself. And here he was, a judge who had spent years operating within that system, sentencing people without truly questioning its fairness. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples, the weight of his realization heavy on him. It wasn't just the fine. It was the way he had dismissed her. How many others had he dismissed in the same way, assuming their cases were cut and dried without ever considering the larger forces at play? How many had left his courtroom feeling unseen, unheard, and unfairly treated? Carrington's thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock at his door. His clerk poked her head in, breaking the silence. "Judge, there's a call for you. It's urgent." "Not now," he muttered, his eyes still glued to the screen, the articles about Tamara flashing before him. The phone kept ringing, but for the first time in a long while, it didn't seem important. What mattered now was Tamara Grant, the woman who had walked into his courtroom that afternoon and unwittingly forced him to face the uncomfortable truth about his own biases and the system he had so faithfully served for years. It was time for a change. But where would it begin? By the following morning, the media was buzzing with stories about Tamara Grant. What had seemed like a routine traffic case had quickly spiraled into something much bigger. News outlets, blogs, and social media were all aflame with questions. Why had she been fined in the first place? Was there more to this than met the eye? People began to dig into her background, and as her name spread, so did the scrutiny. It didn't take long for the story to hit national headlines. News stations picked up on the fact that Tamara wasn't just a random woman in the courthouse. She was the face of federal justice reform. Articles began to pop up, detailing her work advocating for systemic changes, pushing for policies that could overhaul the very criminal justice system that Judge Carrington had served in for decades. She was already well known in activist circles, but now she was in the public eye as a symbol of everything that was wrong with the justice system. The conversation quickly turned from the fine to the larger issue at hand. People began questioning whether the court's treatment of Tamara was indicative of a deeper problem in the system. Was this a case of biased sentencing? Was Tamara's race, her blackness, part of the reason she had been fined in the first place? The online discourse was heated, with some defending Judge Carrington's decision, while others called it out as a glaring example of an unjust system. But the most powerful voices came from Tamara herself, who, in a brief statement, refused to let the fine distract her from the work that needed to be done. "The fine is a minor setback," she said in a television interview. "But the real issue is the systemic injustice that so many people face every day, particularly in communities of color. That's where my focus lies." The backlash against the fine started to gain momentum as activist groups, social justice organizations, and politicians began to rally behind Tamara. They used her case as a springboard to shine a light on issues like racial disparities in the judicial system, mandatory sentencing laws, and the stark inequities in how the system treated different communities. Soon, rallies were being planned, petitions were circulating, and political leaders were calling for public accountability. Meanwhile, Judge Carrington watched it all unfold from his office. The weight of the attention pressed down on him, and he felt cornered in a way he never had before. His email inbox flooded with messages, some in support of him, others filled with harsh criticisms of his handling of the case. He tried to stick to his usual routine, but the calls from reporters and public pressure became too much to ignore. He realized that he had become a symbol of the very issues Tamara had spent years fighting against. But as he read through the news coverage, he began to feel a stir of discomfort. The more he learned about Tamara's advocacy, the more he understood the depth of what was at stake. It wasn't just about a fine anymore. It was about a system that had failed too many people for too long. In the midst of all the noise, Judge Carrington found himself at a crossroads. Could he continue in the same way, untouched by the outcry? Or had he been given an opportunity to do something much larger than he ever expected? The more he thought about Tamara's mission, the clearer it became. This was no longer about a courtroom or a fine. It was about the future of justice itself, and that was something he couldn't ignore. Judge Harold Carrington couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside him. The flood of media coverage, the public outcry, and most unsettling of all, the persistent questions echoing in his own mind, all of it had forced him to confront something he had spent his career avoiding: the undeniable flaws in the very system he had worked so hard to uphold. For days, he had wrestled with his conscience, replaying the moments of the case with Tamara Grant. He could see her in his mind, standing before him with that quiet strength, her calm resolve a stark contrast to the tension in the room. How had he missed it? How had he failed to see that this woman wasn't just a defendant, but someone with a purpose that far exceeded the walls of his courtroom? He'd handed her a fine without a second thought, without understanding the full weight of who she was or the message it sent. As the weeks passed, the fallout from Tamara's case lingered in the air. Judge Carrington found himself attending to his regular caseload, but his thoughts were often elsewhere. It wasn't just the scrutiny from the public or the media. It was the personal reckoning. He began to question his decisions, his assumptions, and the fundamental assumptions of the justice system. He had always prided himself on being fair, on following the law to the letter. But now, it seemed that the law itself was the problem. Carrington had always believed that the system was designed to serve justice, that if he followed the rules, he was doing his job. But now, The very rules he had followed felt outdated, rigid, and in many cases, unfair. The thought made him uneasy. Had he been so entrenched in the system that he couldn't see its flaws? Had his own privilege blinded him to the ways it harmed people like Tamara? He couldn't stop thinking about her words, the way she had spoken so confidently about the need for change, for reform. Her message was clear, and it had struck a chord with him in a way he hadn't expected. One evening, after a particularly long day, Carrington found himself browsing through articles on justice reform. He came across interviews with Tamara, speeches she'd given at rallies and conferences, and stories of the people she had helped. The more he read, the more the pieces started to fall into place. He realized that he had been part of a system that had failed too many people, and while he had tried to do his best, the system itself needed to be reimagined. It wasn't just about sentencing or bail reform. It was about dismantling a structure that disproportionately affected people of color, that prioritized punishment over rehabilitation, and that often ignored the broader context of each individual's circumstances. Tamara had been right all along. The system was broken, and he had been blind to it. Judge Carrington knew that change was needed, but he wasn't sure where to start. The path ahead was unclear, but for the first time in years, he felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could be part of the solution. The next morning, Carrington did something he had never done before. He called his clerk and asked her to set up a meeting, one that would start a journey he couldn't turn back from. He needed to talk to Tamara Grant. Judge Harold Carrington sat at his desk, staring at the invitation on his phone screen. He had requested a meeting with Tamara Grant, and she had agreed. He had no idea what to expect. Would she see him as just another cog in the machine she'd been fighting against? Would she dismiss him as someone too far gone to help? Or would she see, in his eyes, the flicker of a man who had begun to truly listen? When the doorbell rang at his office, he felt his heart rate pick up. He stood quickly, smoothing his suit jacket, as if the formality of the occasion could somehow mask the nervousness creeping in. This wasn't just another meeting. This was his chance to confront everything he had learned in the past few weeks and to do something meaningful with it. Tamara entered, her presence filling the room in the same way it had in the courtroom weeks ago. She was calm, poised, but there was a quiet strength in her that commanded attention. As they exchanged greetings, Judge Carrington felt the weight of his own actions pressing on him. This was no longer about a fine or a single case. It was about everything he had missed, everything he had ignored. "Thank you for meeting with me," he began, leading her to a chair across from his desk. "I know my decision in your case was wrong, and I've been reflecting on it a lot." Tamara's gaze softened. She didn't need to speak immediately. Her quiet confidence filled the space between them, giving him the space to continue. He took a breath, trying to put his thoughts into words. "I've been a judge for more than 20 years. I thought I understood the law. But the truth is, I've been blind to the ways it's shaped people's lives, especially people like you." He paused, eyes downcast, feeling a weight he had never felt before. "I've always thought of myself as fair, but I now see that fairness isn't just about following the rules. It's about seeing the context, the larger picture. I didn't do that with you, and I didn't do it for many others." Tamara listened, her face unreadable, but her eyes, those eyes, showed no judgment. Instead, there was a calm acceptance, as if she understood exactly where he was coming from. "You're right," she said, her voice steady but firm. "The system isn't just about fairness in the way people like to think of it. It's about understanding people's circumstances, their histories, their struggles. The law may be blind, but it's also often ignorant, and that ignorance has consequences." Judge Carrington nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling in. "I've spent so much of my career thinking that I was doing the right thing, following procedure, and believing that things were just the way they were supposed to be," he admitted. "But now I realize that the system isn't just failing people, it's harming them. And I've been part of that." There was a long silence between them. Tamara didn't rush to respond. She let him sit in his own realization, allowing the weight of the moment to settle into the room. Finally, she spoke. "I don't expect you to change overnight, Judge. But the fact that you're even here, having this conversation, means you're already starting to see the world differently. And that's the first step." For the first time in a long while, Carrington felt a sense of clarity. Tamara's words resonated deeply within him. This wasn't just a conversation. It was the beginning of something much larger. Maybe he couldn't fix everything right away, but he could start somewhere. And for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. They spoke for hours, exchanging ideas about reform, about what needed to change in both their fields of work. By the time Tamara left his office, Judge Carrington knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning, and he was ready to be part of the solution, no matter how long the road ahead might be. Weeks after their meeting, Judge Harold Carrington found himself sitting in the back row of a large conference hall, surrounded by a crowd of activists, legal professionals, and reform advocates. The air was thick with anticipation. He was there to hear Tamara Grant speak, an event he had been invited to attend after their meeting. He hadn't expected to feel this nervous, but as he glanced around the room, he realized that this wasn't just any conference. This was a pivotal moment in the fight for justice reform, and Tamara was at the center of it all. He watched as she walked to the podium, her presence commanding the room. There was no grand entrance, no dramatic flair, just a quiet confidence that seemed to draw everyone in. As she began to speak, Judge Carrington found himself leaning forward, hanging on to every word. Tamara's voice was steady and resolute, but there was a warmth to it that made her message all the more powerful. She spoke about the importance of rethinking the entire criminal justice system, about how the laws that had been in place for decades weren't just outdated. They were actively harming people, especially those from marginalized communities. The system was never built to serve everyone, she said, her words ringing clear through the microphone. It was built to serve some and to silence others. But the time for silence is over. We must demand change, not just in the laws, but in the way we see and treat people. Judge Carrington felt a chill run through him. She was speaking directly to the heart of the issue, confronting the uncomfortable truths that he had only just begun to recognize. The system, which he had once believed to be a well-oiled machine, was deeply flawed, and he had been blind to it for far too long. Tamara continued, outlining specific reforms she had been pushing for: changes to sentencing laws, improvements in rehabilitation programs, and greater accountability for law enforcement. But it wasn't just about the policies, she said. It was about a cultural shift, a shift that demanded compassion, empathy, and understanding in a system that had long been driven by punishment and fear. The truth is, people are not statistics. They are not just criminals or defendants. They are human beings who deserve a chance to rebuild their lives, to make amends, and to contribute to society in meaningful ways, she said, her voice unwavering. Our laws should reflect that truth. Judge Carrington felt his heart racing. This was the truth he had been missing all along. He had thought of the law as something rigid, something to be followed without question. But Tamara was showing him that the law, at its core, should be about people, not punishment. As she spoke, Carrington could see the impact she was having on the room. People were nodding, some wiping away tears, others leaning forward in their seats. There was a palpable energy in the air, a collective sense that change was not just possible, it was inevitable. The seeds of reform were being planted, and Tamara Grant was at the forefront. For Judge Carrington, something shifted that day. He realized that he wasn't just watching history unfold. He was part of it. As Tamara wrapped up her speech with a call to action, he knew that his journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. And he was ready to fight for the change she was advocating for, ready to stand alongside her and others who believed that the justice system could and must be better. When the applause broke out, Carrington stood, his hands clapping harder than they ever had before. This was no longer just a matter of policy. It was a movement. and he was now a part of it. Months had passed since Judge Harold Carrington had first met Tamara Grant, and the changes in his life were profound. What had started as an uncomfortable encounter in his courtroom had snowballed into a full-blown journey of transformation. His office had become a place of reflection, research, and most importantly, action. The conversations he had once avoided, those about racial disparities, systemic injustice, and rehabilitation, had become the focal point of his professional and personal life. Tamara had become both a friend and an inspiration. They spoke regularly, collaborating on initiatives, attending reform meetings together, and challenging each other's perspectives. The more Carrington learned, the more he understood that true justice wasn't about following procedure for the sake of procedure. It was about ensuring fairness, empathy, and accountability. It wasn't long before Judge Carrington began making changes within his own courtroom, small at first, but significant. He started to ask more questions during sentencing hearings, questions about the context of the cases before him, about the history of the defendants, and about their potential for rehabilitation. He implemented new programs for diversion, allowing those charged with minor offenses to receive support and counseling rather than being punished with jail time. He worked with local community organizations to connect defendants to resources that might help them rebuild their lives. The response was mixed. Some of his colleagues were skeptical, even critical. They couldn't understand why he was so eager to change the system they had worked in for years. But Judge Carrington knew that he couldn't go back. Not now. Not after everything he had seen and learned. In the broader community, Tamara's voice continued to grow louder. She led rallies, spoke before Congress, and worked with policymakers to push for federal reforms. Her work wasn't easy. No movement of real change ever was. But she pressed on with the same quiet determination that had first caught Judge Carrington's attention. Her name had become synonymous with justice reform, and her influence was spreading like wildfire. One day, as he sat in his office reviewing a sentencing case, Carrington received a call from Tamara. She was in town for a national conference on criminal justice reform, and she wanted to know if he would be attending. It was a simple question, but for Carrington, it was a sign of how far things had come. "Of course," he replied, a smile tugging at his lips. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." That night, as he listened to her speak at the conference, he realized how much he had changed. He no longer saw himself as just a judge. He was a part of something larger, a movement that was bigger than any one case or courtroom. He was no longer a passive observer of the system. He was an active participant in its evolution. As Tamara wrapped up her speech with a call to action, he knew the road ahead was still long. But for the first time, he felt truly hopeful. The work they were doing was just beginning, and together, they would help shape a future where justice didn't just mean following the law. It meant serving people. When the event ended, Judge Carrington stepped off the stage and found Tamara waiting for him. She smiled, her eyes full of understanding. "I'm glad you're here," she said. "We're in this together now." Carrington nodded, feeling more certain than ever. "I'm in, and I won't stop until we've made this system work for everyone." And so, together, they continued to push forward, knowing that change was possible. One case, one conversation, and one reformed law at a time.